latecomers. Yeah, I'd like to welcome everybody who's here today. And we'll probably have a few latecomers. Welcome faculty, staff, administrators, students. We're really happy that you could be here today to learn a little bit about leadership, think more deeply about leadership. We have great lessons to learn over the course of this semester. This is a once-a-month lecture and discussion that's led by Dr. Jean Crumley, a well-known leadership coach and a person who knows a lot about leadership from along many different dimensions. He's at UC Davis and at UC Merced, and we're fortunate to have him here with us today and to be helping us think about and do better with leadership. Jean, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you. And I wanted to thank Christian Walker for helping us coordinate this talk. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks, Christian. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. So the story that I'm going to tell today begins on March 27th, 1977. So on March 27th, 1977, a fully loaded Boeing 747 crashed into another fully loaded Boeing 747 at the Los Rodeos Regional Airport on the small island of Tenerife. Tenerife is off the coast of Morocco, and Tenerife is part of what is referred to as the Canary Islands. There were a combined total of 644 people on board those two planes. And of that 644, 583 died that day. So what caused this tragedy to occur? Well, the conventional answer is pilot error. Now, when we think of when we ask a question like what caused the tragedy at Tenerife, we're asking what I call and what might be thought of as a single loop question. So a single loop question, it would be this one: what caused the tragedy? And the single loop answer would be pilot error. Single loop questions tend to stop further inquiry because they generally yield simple, direct, and often unquestioned answers. For example, what is the thermostat set of? If I were to ask you or you were to ask me, what's the thermostat set of? We might turn and look at it and then respond 68 degrees. So in contrast to these single loop questions, double loop questions push inquiry further. So back to that simple example, why is it set at 68? Not just what is the temperature, but why is it set there? So that would be the double loop question. So the single loop question, what caused the tragedy? Pilot error. When we ask the double loop question, what caused it? Well, actually, there are lots of reasons. So the first one is that things happen in life that are random. And by definition, a random event means it's out of our control. Now, when unanticipated or random events happen, there's a very predictable effect upon the brain. And what happens when these unanticipated events initially occur? They raise the brain's stress response. Now, the stress response is going to include, and here my computer's going to get a little funky, or whoa, let me jump back. So it's going to raise the brain's stress response. What is less predictable, however, is how the mind is going to interpret that challenge after the initial and reflexive response. And it turns out a critical variable is a sense of control. So when we have a sense of control in our environment, there's going to be that initial spike. That happens reflexively. We can't stop that initial stress response. So it's going to drive up our heart rate. It's going to drive up our blood pressure, and our field of vision, literally what we see, shrinks. It is restricted. But if we have a sense of control after that initial shock, then what happens is our heart rate starts to slow down, blood pressure lowers, and our field of vision starts to open up. And I apologize for why I have this delay. Let me make sure. Yeah. Okay. So Come on. All right, let me jump back. So on March 27th, the date in question, 1977, KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, Holland's carrier, KLM 4805, that was the flight, was scheduled for a nonstop flight from the airport in Amsterdam, Schiphol, to the main airport in the Canary Islands. Now there's several islands. The main one is Gran Canaria. And that flight was going to be 4.5 hours. About 4 hours into the flight, the KLM pilot is diverted. Air traffic control comes on and diverts them from Gran Canaria to the airport on Tenerife. The pilot's told from air traffic control that there's a terrorist group, ETA was the group, and it's threatening to set off a bomb at the Gran Canaria airport. Now, the airport from Gran Canaria to Tenerife, they're only 60 miles apart, so it's really only about a 10-15 minutes at the most flight from one to the other. Now, these two airports are only 60 miles apart, but they're actually, in fact, worlds apart. Tenerife, the one that the plane is getting diverted to, unlike Gran Canaria, which is where it was originally going to land, was a regional airport. Now, it was designed and built to handle much smaller commercial aircraft and then mostly private aircraft. It was never designed, it was never intended to be able to land Boeing 747s, the largest commercial plane at the time in the air. And on March 27th, again, this date in question, there are going to be a total of 5 747s, as well as many other planes that would have otherwise landed at Gran Canaria. They're going to land on Tenerife as well. And one of those is the KLM flight 4805. So I apologize for having to jump around. I have never figured out what's going on, why there's a delay when I click and the slide come up. So the airport on Tenerife was very adequate for a regional airport. But on March 27th, all of its systems, from its air traffic control system, the tower that you see there in the picture on the left, and the single runway. Now, Gran Canaria, like all international airports, is going to have multiple runways. The one on Tenerife, though, has just got a single runway, and they're overwhelmed, both the air traffic control and the runway itself. So the second reason that this tragedy occurs has to do with this idea of systems being either tightly or loosely coupled. That's the term of art used in systems theory. Systems are either tightly coupled or loosely coupled. So a loosely coupled system means that there's redundancy, backup, that's built into the system. And the idea behind redundancy, behind backup, is that in case something fails, it doesn't cascade, as I'll talk about here in just a moment. Now, contrast a loosely coupled system with a tightly coupled system, and those systems do not have backup. They are sometimes referred to as lean systems. And Tenerife was a lean system, if you will, a non-backed up. Because backup and redundancy, what they really are costs looked at from one point of view. Now, the airport at Tenerife, again, that small regional airport, was designed as a tightly coupled system. It was designed just for regional air traffic. It was not designed for international flights to be coming in and out. In fact, before March 27th, there had never been an international flight because it wasn't built. It also wasn't sanctioned to serve anything other than regional flight. So when a loosely coupled system experiences failure, it's never catastrophic, because that's what redundancy does in a system, it acts like a firewall against a phenomenon known as cascading effect. So cascading effect is when a failure in one part of a system causes a chain reaction cascade of failures throughout the entire system. And when these cascading effects begin, they almost always result in what is termed catastrophic failure. So a much larger failure than the original failure. But again, because there's no firewalls, there's no redundancies built in, a tightly coupled system, once there's a failure, it begins to cascade through the entire system, and it results in catastrophic failure. And next slide. Jump back. And the perception of a cascading event is going to have a very predictable effect on the mind. It's going to create a sense of panic. Now, a mind in a state of panic is what I am going to call a binary mind. And what I mean by that is when our minds go binary, the world becomes black and white. There's only two possibilities. The third reason the tragedy at Tenerife occurred is that a mind in a state of sustained panic, now that's important here, that modifier, sustained panic. When a mind is in sustained panic, again, that binary mind, it doesn't see alternatives. When we're not in a state of panic, we can look at a situation and we can see alternatives. Well, I could take this course of action, I could take this course of action, I could take this course of action. That's what a mind, a relaxed mind, if you will, is like. It can see alternatives. But a panicked mind, a mind in sustained panic, it doesn't see alternatives. It just sees chaos. So when KLM 4805 lands on Tenerife, it's 1:30 p.m. Now that landing time is going to be critical because the pilot and crew at that point had exactly 5 hours to unload their passengers. They've got 300 plus passengers. They've got to unload them all. They've got to restock and refuel the plane. Then they have to load all the new passengers, and then they have to have takeoff clearance no later than 6:30 p.m. So why do they only have or exactly have 5 hours? Well, actually, two reasons. The first is there is a policy within the airline. KLM has a policy that there's a certain amount of time that pilots and crews can be in the air, and therefore they can't take off beyond a certain hard deadline, because then they would violate the company's policy. So that would be one of the two reasons. Turns out there was actually a much more severe reason why it was exactly 5 hours. And that is, in Holland, in the Netherlands, it is against the law. It is criminally punishable to fly after that mandated period of time. And it results in imprisonment. It's not just a fine, it's imprisonment if a pilot takes off after that limit of flying time. Now, after landing at Tenerife at 1:30 p.m., the pilot of the KLM flight is told that the plane cannot be unloaded immediately. Now, of course, once they had landed at Gran Canaria, there's plenty of support. There's all the jetways and the gates for the plane to pull into. And so as soon as they land at Gran Canaria, they can unload passengers, but that's not going to be the case at Tenerife. The pilot's told that it's going to be about 15 minutes before they can wheel over one of these ramps, one of these portable ramps, and unload the passengers. So after 15 minutes, the ground crew has not wheeled over that temporary ramp, and the pilot of KLM 4805 radios traffic control when it's been more than 15 minutes, and is asking, okay, where's the ramp? We have passengers to get off. He's told the ground crew is going to get to the plane as soon as possible. And he's also told, don't keep radioing us. We'll tell you when the ground crew is ready to unload. An hour after arrival at 2:30, the 317 passengers on KLM 4805 finally begin to disembark the plane. Now, as soon as the passengers are off the plane, because the pilot cannot leave the plane until absolutely every person is off, all 317 passengers, all the crew, and including the co-pilot. So the pilot is literally the last person off the plane and the first person on the plane. So as soon as the pilot's off the plane, goes into the airport, remember it's 1977, it is more than 10 years before the first very primitive cell phones are going to be available. Goes into the airport, remember it's a little regional airport, there's not a bunch of payphones, there's not a bunch of phones available, there are very limited amount of phones. And by the time he can reach Amsterdam, because remember he's got to make that long distance call to the headquarters in Amsterdam to find out, what he can do. It's 4:30. So now he's already lost 3 of the 5 hours before he finds out definitively, you have to obey that policy. And if you don't, you will be in violation of company policy, but you'll also be in violation of the criminal code for the Netherlands. So he's at that point, he's only got another hour before he's got to get off the ground with all those passengers. So remember what I said about a mind in a state of sustained panic. He's 3 hours now into this totally unexpected event that's really starting to create a lot of stress, not just on him, but on everybody. So remember, a mind in a state of panic, in a sustained state of panic, is binary. It's not going to see alternatives. It's only going to see things black and white. So for the pilot, that means if he is not airborne by 6:30 at the absolute latest, it's over. It's catastrophic. And because there's this little island does not have enough hotel beds. There's not another crew on the island that could sub out for the pilot and crew. So it will be a catastrophe in the pilot's mind if they can't get airborne. Reason number 4. So at about 4 o'clock, a rumor begins to circulate at the airport that Gran Canaria is going to reopen at 5. However, no one can confirm that rumor. It's just that. It is simply a rumor. Now, the flying time, remember I told you, from Tenerife to Gran Canaria is less than 15 minutes. Refueling time at Gran Canaria, remember it's a major international airport, so it's going to have a whole different level of services, is 35 minutes. So on Gran Canaria, the pilot of KLM 4805 could refuel the plane in 35 minutes. On Tenerife, it's going to take at least an hour. So at 5 o'clock, the refueling begins on KLM 4805. Now, the regulations at that airport and actually all the airports is once refueling begins on a plane, it cannot be stopped until it's completed. So the KLM starts refueling at 5 o'clock. It can't stop until at least an hour later when the plane is completely refueled. 5 minutes into that refueling, it's announced that the Gran Canaria airport has reopened. And once that occurs, departures from Tenerife begin almost immediately. Some of the other planes that don't need to refuel, they now start taking off. But for KLM 4805, the refueling started, can't be stopped. So now I want to talk about this incredibly powerful emotion of regret. So regret is an emotion of loss. And the biology here is straightforward. The neural activity associated with loss is much greater, at least twice as great as the neural activity with gain. So we feel a loss of any kind twice the level that we would feel or experience a gain of any kind. So if we lost a $20 bill out of our pocket, the loss would be experienced much greater than if we were to find a $20 bill. So in the grip of regret, we're susceptible to a phenomenon referred to as perseveration. And perseveration is simply the idea of returning over and over again to the same idea, the same memory, or the same thought pattern. And perseveration is going to heighten all emotions associated with loss, especially the emotion of regret. So reason number 5. When KLM 4805 is finished refueling, it's now 6:10 p.m. So it's taken 70 minutes to refuel. And in those 70 minutes, a dense fog has now engulfed the airport. So the last plane to be diverted and land at Tenerife was Pan Am 1736, another 747. So Pan Am 1736 lands at 5:45 p.m. And after it's landed, it's still on the runway 45 minutes later. At 6:15, so we're now down to 15 minutes before in 15 minutes, the pilot of 4805 has to be in the air to be able to fly legally. Now, at 6:15, air traffic control gives him clearance to taxi out onto the end of the runway. Now, at that point, there's only about 300 yards of visibility in that dense fog. And what that means is that neither the pilot of KLM 4805 nor the pilot of Pan Am 1736 can see each other because the fog is so dense. Now at 6 o'clock, just before 4805 is given clearance to taxi out, at 6 o'clock, there's a mandatory shift change that's occurring at the Tenerife Air Traffic Control Tower because air traffic control, just like all the other regulations around commercial flight, is very regulated. So at 6 o'clock, there is this mandatory shift change. And this shift change happens in a pretty rushed and chaotic fashion because typically there are no shift changes like this. The shift changes, there's very few planes, if any, on the ground when there's a change. Sometimes there is no shift change because there's no flights scheduled to come in later. So when this transition occurs, it's rushed and it's chaotic. And it's not at all clear from all the transcripts available that the new crew coming on was aware that 1736 is still on the runway. Remember, there's just a single runway at Tenerife. Now, after taxiing out to the end of the runway, the pilot of 4805 pushes his engines on that 747 to full throttle, as though ready to take off. Now, the black box indicates that the co-pilot then says to the pilot in this sort of alarmed fashion, probably because of these revving engines, we don't have ATC clearance. We don't have air traffic control clearance. Now, the black box also indicates that the pilot responds, I know that. Go ahead and ask. So at 6:20 p.m., air traffic control radios that Pan Am 1736 flight, remember the one that's down at the end of the runway, that neither plane can see the other. The air traffic control radios them instructions to start taxiing back down the runway. There's just the one runway. So come down the runway and take exit 3. So there's only one runway at the airport, and there are 3 not particularly well-marked exits. And this is critical. Neither the pilot of KLM 4805 nor the pilot of Pan Am 1736 had ever landed at Tenerife. This was the first time for both of them to ever land there. So they had no familiarity whatsoever with that airport or that runway or how the exits were configured or numbered, anything like that. Now, the black box from 1736 indicates that there's some confusion and disagreement between the pilot and co-pilot regarding how those 3 exits are numbered. So there's a lot of back and forth between those two, trying to determine what is the 3rd exit. Now at 6:25 p.m., just 5 minutes before KLM 4805 needs to be airborne, KLM gets what is called airway clearance. The black box indicated no mention whatsoever of takeoff clearance. Now, airway clearance and takeoff clearance are terms of art in aviation, in commercial aviation. In essence, airway clearance is how air traffic control signals to the pilot that takeoff clearance is going to be imminent. So in other words, when you get airway clearance as a pilot, it's the signal from air traffic control, get ready because you're going to next get soon takeoff clearance. But as you can see, those terms are very similar and very similar sounding. So at 6:25 p.m., Pan Am 1736 is still taxiing down the single runway looking for exit 3. And at 6:25 p.m., after getting airway clearance, not takeoff clearance, airway clearance, the pilot for KLM 4805 begins to move down the runway. So full throttle on the engines, moving down, even though, again, air traffic control has not given them takeoff clearance. When the 2 pilots make visual contact with each other, the only hope at that point is for KLM to pull up the nose of the plane in as steep a climb as is possible mechanically and go to full power. And for Pan Am 1736 to, under, again, full power, make as sharp a left turn as possible. And neither maneuver are going to be successful. So how did this tragedy happen? Well, again, the conventional answer is pilot error. But when failures occur, often a single or lone individual or group is blamed because it's a very easy and satisfying conclusion to reach. It's that single loop question phenomenon. What causes it? Pilot error. So why did the tragedy at Tenerife happen? Well, pilot error is Captain Jacob von Zanten at KLM 4805. He should have never started running down that runway when all he had was airway clearance, not takeoff clearance. And that's the conventional answer. But that answer is way too simple. And here I want to introduce this concept I call the chain of causality. So when a failure or error occurs of any kind, not just this enormous tragedy at Tenerife, but any kind of error, any kind of failure, there is always a chain of events, a series of links, series of events that lead up to that failure. However, we almost always focus on the last link in that chain because instead of earlier ones, and the question is why? Well, it's because it's easy. You just look for the last set of fingerprints. Who was the last person involved just before the error occurs? So that's easy, but it's also lazy. It's much harder to focus further back from that last link. And that's why asking a single loop question is easier because it tends to stop. We just point to the last link and say, well, there's the reason why. The pilot for KLM violated the rules, started jamming down the runway with airway clearance and not takeoff clearance. But when we ask the question with a double loop, that's going to be harder, but it's also going to provide us with some very, very important insights. Here's the other phenomenon, and this is why single loop questions and answers tend to be so prevalent, is when we ask a single loop question or we give a single loop answer, it makes us look smart. It makes us appear smart to others, and we feel smart when we say pilot error or any kind of snappy, tight answer. It makes us look smart, makes us sound smart. But the reality is, leaders never fail because they're not smart enough. You don't get into a leadership position if you're not smart. Instead, failure occurs not because leaders aren't smart enough, it's because leaders aren't curious enough to keep questioning themselves and others, to keep pushing the inquiry further, that double loop activity. So what's the takeaway here? Well, it is impossible to avoid making decisions under pressure. That is simply a part of life, and we will never have the luxury of never having to make decisions other than with lots of time, no constraints. It's just, that's impossible. So we've got to figure out how can we make decisions under pressure and not have them be catastrophic. And I think there are really important things we can learn from this story that occurred at Tenerlife, both as leaders and just simply as human beings. So here's the first lesson I would draw. Things happen in life that are random. And again, by definition, a random event means it's out of our control. And the moment one of those random events occurs out of our control, it's at that moment in our rearview mirror. We don't see random events in the future. We only see random events in the moment and then out the rearview mirror. And therefore, we cannot control a random event. And that means sometimes the best thing we can do when something unexpected happens is to take the Queen of Hearts advice from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and don't just do something, stand there. Because here's the reality about time. Time is never neutral. Time is binary. It's either an enemy or an ally. And leaders who learn how to wait patiently when unexpected things happen have a great advantage over leaders who react immediately and often impulsively. So we want to take this advice seriously. Don't just do something. Stand there. Be patient. Wait. Let time elapse so that we can see more fully what's going on. Don't react, respond. The second lesson is that systems are either tightly or loosely coupled. Remember, loosely coupled systems have redundancy or backup built into them in case something happens. Tightly coupled systems do not have backup because that's viewed as redundancy, and redundancy is viewed as cost. However, leaders who build or favor tightly coupled systems In order to save costs, they look smart. They look strategic. I saved costs. I cut the budget. I know how to save money. Sure looks smart until a failure occurs. Because leaders who build tightly coupled systems put themselves and their organizations at greater risk of a simple failure turning into a catastrophic one. Lesson number 3. A mind in a state of sustained panic is a binary mind. It doesn't see alternatives. Instead, it sees chaos. So leaders who build self-awareness in themselves and in others have an advantage when failures occur because they know how to ask for help. They know how to ask for advice from others instead of trying to figure out everything by themselves. That is probably one of the great tragedies of the story at Tenerlife is Captain von Zanten didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for advice. He just tried to figure out things on his own. Lesson number 4. The emotion of regret is an emotion of loss. And leaders, and we as just human beings, we need to know this biology. We need to know that the neural activity associated with loss is much greater than that associated with gain. Therefore, we know that, come on, PowerPoint, that in the grip of regret, we're going to be susceptible to perseveration. That idea of just returning over and over again to the same idea of memory or thought. And therefore, as leaders, but just as thoughtful human beings, we've got to learn and teach others that the past can't be changed. We can't undo what's already happened. That's why these random events, these unforeseen circumstances are always in the rearview mirror, almost exactly the moment we encounter them. So leaders, wise leaders, learn and teach others the past cannot be changed, but it can be redeemed. And this is where the chain of causality becomes so incredibly important, because the way we redeem the past is by learning to move back up that chain of causality, because the further we move back on that chain, the easier it's going to be to interrupt that failure from occurring, both in terms of time and effort. And one of the most important moves as we move back up the chain of causality after we've experienced a failure is to remind ourselves and others, or to learn for the first time, we want to build in redundancy. We want to build in firewalls. We don't want to save money when it really puts us at great risk. So I'm going to stop at that point. By my watch, we've got more than 15 minutes left, where I give you the chance for last thoughts and final questions. So you could use the chat feature, or you could unmute. So thoughts or questions about anything I had to say this afternoon? Please, Alvin, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Crumley, for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious, though, because in your first suggestion, you suggest, don't just do something, stand there, right? And so one of the things that I've experienced is, I'm waiting on a leader to make a decision, but they've chosen to stand there. So what is your recommendation for me to do? Should I also stand there?
Yeah, so the leader's not doing but half their job in that situation, Alvin, because leaders not only have to practice it, they have to teach that. They have to explain to the people they lead, so why is it that we're waiting rather than reacting? Because this is where this idea of time is an ally or an adversary, an enemy. So when things happen, our kind of evolutionary pressure is to react. to do something. And reaction is flight or fight, typically. But those aren't always the best of the choices. So what we want to do is when something happens we hadn't anticipated, then if we can wait and be patient, often more information will come in that will help us make a good decision. But our tendency as human beings is we want to react. We want to get out of that situation. And what good leaders do is they discipline themselves, and then they teach that discipline to others by saying, hang on, let's wait. Let's see what new information might come in, and then we will respond to the situation rather than react to the situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I see why you say time can either be on your side or against you, right? Because if you're trying to make a decision and your time's up, it's not in your favor, right?
Yeah, so there was a really wonderful book written a few years ago now, and I can't remember the exact title, but the argument that the authors were making is that we tend to make decisions too quickly. And if we would wait just a little bit, we would be able to respond better. And they use some very interesting illustrations of this. So one illustration is they went back and looked with a high-speed camera. So a high-speed camera simply allows you to look frame by frame in these tiny increments of time. And they were looking specifically at reaction times by the highest level professional tennis players. Now remember, that tennis ball is coming over typically at a serve somewhere about 140 to 170 miles an hour. And the difference in the response time from good professional tennis players and the best professionals was really thousandths of a second. But the best players use those extra thousandths of a second to make better responses. And then of course they used other examples where there's more time. But even at something that seems like purely a reaction, there was evidence to suggest that just the slightest bit of delay allowed just that little bit better response. Because when you're talking about the professional level, we're talking about tiny little differences between the players, not big differences. And then the most famous illustration of that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union, this is well before all of you were ever born, but the former Soviet Union had positioned missiles on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles off of Florida. And that was a very provocative move by Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union at the time. And John Kennedy, the president, was getting a lot of encouragement from his generals to attack. And some of them were even encouraging him to launch a preemptory nuclear strike. And what Kennedy did, and his younger brother, Robert Kennedy, who was his attorney general, was helpful to his older brother in that setting, because after the generals and all the secretaries of state and defense and others had left the room, he would be there just with his younger brother. And one of the questions that we know that Robert Kennedy would ask his brother is what I refer to as the chess question, not the checkers question. And Robert Kennedy was asked his brother, okay, so if you do this, what next? And a lot of leaders play checkers instead of chess. They think one move at a time. Just react to the situation. Just react to this situation. And unfortunately, we have this myth, this lie around good leadership is decisive and action oriented and just reacts to situations. Well, I think that's actually poor leadership. I think good leadership is responding, thinking not just about one move, but the next move and the move after that. And how might the other party respond to those various moves? And that takes time to think strategically. It takes no time to react emotionally, but it does take time to respond intelligently. Does that make a little more sense? Maybe, I
Yeah,
hope.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I'm curious if there's I'm sure it's hard to really point out or pick, but is there a golden time where, that's perfect?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So,
That as well. So thank you, Alvin.
yeah. So the answer is right up until it's too late. So when you're
That
talking
1 second, right? That 1 second before
well,
it's too
when you're
late.
talking professional tennis, you're only talking thousands of a second. When you're talking the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis, you're talking days as opposed to hours. So it's contingent upon the context, but you want to wait until the last possible moment, because the longer you can wait, the greater the potential for additional information to come in that would shape your thinking. So
That makes
great
sense.
question.
Yeah.
And I see I've got a chat, so let me read that. Okay. So Becky, did I answer your question then, or should I come at it a little more?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did. I mean, that's the $100 million, question right there. When is the right time? And so, I mean, I think that, yeah, you can learn a lot from learning to wait, not react. But I think that what we do find in leadership is that there are those that take a little too long, and matters could be resolved had something been said or done sooner. So
yeah. So that's you've got a really a really important point that you're making, and so I'm going to come back to what I said to Alvin, and that is we want to wait until the absolute last moment before it's too late. And what you're talking about, Becky, is it's too late when it's clear to everybody what the obvious answer and right answer is, but now we've to some degree degraded that optimum period of time, that optimum answer, because we have waited too long. My experience is that we can very easily retrieve examples of leaders waiting too long to make a decision. But I, in fact, am convinced that there is many more times where it wouldn't necessarily be a wrong answer. It wouldn't be a bad answer, but it would not be an optimum answer when it's made too quickly. And I think that, so we want to kind of think about responses on sort of a distribution curve. We want to get out to that thin end of the tail on the right, where we're getting the best possible outcome at the absolute best possible time. And anything behind that is less optimal. And then at that thin end of the tail on the other end, when we've waited too long or reacted too quickly, those are going to be much less optimal responses. Doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to be catastrophic, but they're going to be suboptimal. Teeny, you've got your hand up. Thanks.
Yeah. This has got me thinking about communication and how the response, the informative response, is best conveyed, what mechanism. So I know and I very much appreciate Alvin and Becky's contributions here. So in my role, sometimes when I have to let people, faculty or postdocs or whatever the group of recipients is, sometimes it's hard to know initially, do I email them, or who should this come from, my office or me, or should this be the provost and myself? And
Yeah.
maybe this should be, something that goes out in a more formal memo or in the body of the email. Any thoughts on that? That's a really generic question.
No,
but
no, no, it's a great question. It's actually a very specific question. It's a good one. So my response in those kinds of situations is to reply immediately by saying, I'm going to think about this, or I'm going to consult with some others, and I will get back to you. Or that's an interesting question that had not occurred to me. Let me think about that, and then you get back to me. So you notice I've put the responsibility on two different sets of shoulders, depending upon what I think is the appropriateness and the gravity of the situation. If it's a situation where I want to make sure that either myself or the people I'm going to consult with, or the people I'm going to refer it to who are going to make the decision, if I want the responsibility for that decision to rest on our shoulders, then I'm going to respond to the person and say, I'll get back to you. And that response might be, I've now talked with the provost, or I've talked to someone, and I've passed on your concern, and they will be getting back to you. So the initial, because what I want to do is I want to manage people's emotion, manage people's expectations, and that is managing their emotions as well. So I want to manage people's expectations. I think that's one of the fundamental things that leaders don't necessarily do particularly well. Sending an email and then never hearing back from someone, or not hearing back, within a reasonable period of time, that is not good management of expectations. So I like to write back to someone and say, that's a good question. I want to think about it. I'll get back to you. Or that's a good question. I want to confer with others, and one of us will get back to you at the earliest possible time. On the other hand, if I don't think it's an issue that really falls within my pale of responsibility or anybody else's, it's in fact the other person trying to export their issue to me that they should be dealing with, they should be responsible for, then I might say, that's an interesting question. Let me think about it. And then the responsibility, because now you've indicated there's a live body at the end of that email, but you've left the responsibility where it is, because the reality is leaders tend to do two things, neither of which are helpful. Sometimes leaders don't take responsibility. In fact, we live in a time and an age where increasingly people in leadership responsibilities only want to take credit for things and never want to take responsibility, or they take this faux responsibility. Mistakes was made. It's my office is responsible, or I'm responsible, but then they don't do anything. They don't change. That's a faux responsive or a signal of responsibility. So I think we live in a time, unfortunately, where leaders don't take responsibility, or they take too much responsibility. They take inappropriate responsibility for other people's issues. There's and Tina, you're familiar with this term out of psychiatric medicine. It's referred to as infantilizing. And infantilizing infants is the very appropriate thing to do. You do not want to let infants and small children make decisions that could be have serious consequences. You don't let them walk out into the street and learn that if you do that, you get hit by a car, and that could be a bad outcome. So we infantilize infants and small children. But when we treat adults like infants, where we don't let them enjoy the fruits of their decisions, good and bad, bitter, then we're infantilizing. And leaders do this all the time for the best best of reasons, because people in leadership often are caring people. They're compassionate people. They want to help others. That's why they wanted to be in a leadership position. They wanted to help others. The problem with that is sometimes we don't allow people to take care of their own problems. We take them on ourselves, and that's never helpful with adults. Adults need to learn to solve the problems that they can solve. Now, sometimes we help because they can't solve the problem on their own, but that's where we've got to be wise as leaders. We've got to really figure out, is this a problem someone can actually take care of themselves, but they're trying to export it to me, trying to see if, my port of entry is open for that export. And that's not a good move on leaders' part. We need to let people take responsibility for their own decisions. And then if they ask our counsel that, here's the situation I'm facing, what do you think? Well, of course we would want to help them think it through. We just don't want to take on the responsibility for them when in fact it should reside with them. I think we have maybe time for one more thought or question, and then we'll need to call it a day. So any last thoughts or questions? All right. Well, then I am going to, here's one. Thanks, Christian. So if you do have a thought and want to send me an email, you can send it to either of my addresses. So at Merced, I'm C. Crumley. My legal name is Charles Crumley, but I go by Gene. That's my middle name. But at UC Merced, you would send it to ccrumley@ucmerced.edu, or you could send it to my UC Davis email address, which is CE Crumley, Charles Eugene Crumley @ucdavis.edu. Don't send it to G Crumley at either of those addresses because it will never reach me. So C Crumley @ucmerced.edu for Merced, and CE Crumley for Davis. All right, thanks everyone. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And Teeny and Christian, could you stay on for just a second?
Sure. Thanks, everybody. See you February 11th and help us spread the word. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.